I love JoJo, both as a show and sexually. Not that I'm gay or anything, but can you really blame me? Very few times do I enjoy a show and actually feel motivated to watch it, and this is one of the few exceptions. Each of the JoJo parts stands out in their own manner, having their own strengths and weaknesses, although mostly strengths. But I think that part 5, Golden Wind, perfects the JoJo formula. No show can be perfect, far from it, but I think that Golden Wind is perfect. For me, when a show has so much good that it outweighs whatever bad it has, then it is considered to be perfect. It's hard to explain why Golden Wind is perfect though, so that's why I made like a 50-minute long video explaining why it's perfect. No need to thank me. From the characters, to the theme, to the journey itself, I think these aspects are executed perfectly, so without dragging this intro out for too long, I think it's time to explore what makes Golden Wind so perfect. Fate. What is it? A lot of us have heard of it before, but none of us truly knows what it means. This is the case because we can never experience fate. Even if there was no fate, then we still would not know if there was any. Fate is a predetermined outcome of an event that will happen no matter what, even if you take the long way or the short way. This concept of fate has been the underlying theme of the entirety of the JoJo series, but I'd like to argue that this part is the brightest it shines. Each of our main characters have had pretty rough upbringings, with them basically being disowned by society itself. Instead of giving up and living the rest of their lives as outcasts, they instead find their resolve in them and look for a way out. Resolve. That is the single most important trait a human can possess. It is the ability to look for a way to be successful no matter the situation. Even though these characters were fated to have miserable lives, they resolved against their fate to lead them to a better life. This is the theme of Golden Wind. Resolve against fate. To resolve against fate is to actively fight against the situations you've been placed in to put yourself in a better one. This story, at its heart, is about a group of brave individuals who go against fate to try to achieve something that is righteous, just, and greater than themselves. During the journey, they not only have to resolve to change fate, but have to resolve to better themselves, and find the truth that they are searching for. This theme can be seen throughout the entirety of the story. All the characters, plot, anything really, is to help support this theme, and this is why I think Golden Wind is so great. Everything in the story revolves around the theme, and not the other way around. This helps people be more immersed in and invested in the story simply because of this approach. One of the most important scenes in Golden Wind is when Abakio gets reunited with a police officer that sacrificed his life to save his. The police officer teaches him a lesson, that you cannot look for any shortcuts when trying to resolve against fate. You have to take the proper way, because otherwise, you'll lose sight of the truth. You'll only be focused on the results rather than the actions you take, and thus forget about what you're really after. This is also very important, as it supplements the main theme, and can be seen with the duality in the show, with good versus evil, Giorno versus the boss, defender versus enemy. This is very prominent in Golden Wind, and the ones who lose sight of the truth are already fated to lose. Let me end this off with one final note. In the fight with Mista and Gyatso, Mista loses sight of his goal, and therefore his resolve is hindered. Giorno makes a speech in order to give Mista the resolve to keep fighting and look for the truth, and I think this speech captures the whole theme of Golden Wind. But the only ones who can open a path in the darkness are those with resolve. We're going to have to make some sacrifices, but my resolve, as well as Mista's, will open up a path in the darkness. Resolve doesn't mean sacrifice. Mista, having resolve is the ability to open up a path we need to follow in the darkness. After thinking about this script for a little while, and contemplating over what makes Golden Wind's characters so memorable, I couldn't decide what to make the main focus be. When I thought that I found what it should be, I realized that it would be completely undermining a different aspect of the characters. But after thinking about it for a while, I realized it's their presentation. The presentation makes these characters so memorable. In many different shows, the presentation of a character isn't done so well, this making the characters rather forgettable, but in Golden Wind, that couldn't be further from the case. This part shows the character's story, journey, struggles, resolution. Finding out about a character is like a mini show in itself, unfolding in front of your own eyes. Probably the best and most impressive example of this would be Pessy. Pessy only appeared in 3 episodes, but his story still is one of the most noteworthy in the show. During the fight with Bruno's gang, we see the character development of Pessy, with this being so notable because it's one of the only times in the series where instead of seeing someone go from bad to good, we see Pessy go from good to bad. He transforms into a killer. In the beginning of the fight, Pessy alongside Prosciutto go on the train in hopes of finding and kidnapping the boss's daughter. Almost immediately, you could tell that Prosciutto was the most dangerous person here. You could tell because of his calming, almost unsettling nature, as if he wasn't faced by anything. He also constantly criticized Pessy for how weak-minded he was and how he isn't fully using the power of his stand. This automatically tells us that Pessy is sort of an outlier to the group and how he's a little brother to Prosciutto. We can further see this in the battle with Mista, where he flunders once he destroys the ice and would have lost if Prosciutto didn't interfere. However, once Prosciutto tries to kamikaze, Pessy goes sicko mode. He finally realizes what Prosciutto was talking to him about, and is armed with a vengeance to kill. Just like that, he's finally evolved to someone who belongs in the Hitman team. With this newfound realization, he's now more confident and does every move swiftly. He isn't afraid to kill, and uses his stand not to weaken his opponents, but to kill them. This is further signified through his facial expressions and how he suddenly doesn't look timid and afraid anymore, but instead assertive and confident. However, his old nature eventually comes back once he couldn't find Bruno and thinks he's made a mistake. He then stops the train and flounders the battle, leading to his death. Just in the span of 3 episodes, Araki told us a story of a person evolving into the ruthless killer that he was expected to be, but lost due to his original weakness. We all thought that during this fight, Prosciutto was going to be the main problem, but we got bamboozled because of Araki's amazing storytelling ability. Another way which Araki shows us the story of these characters is through flashbacks. These flashbacks give us a quick synopsis of the character's life, and it really sets up a theme for them. The most memorable use of these flashbacks for me were Cicolata and Secco, and Jesus Christ, these characters were the golden experience. These characters were made to be the most villainous, messed up, twisted characters the series has ever seen, and this has definitely been accomplished. I mean, Devalo, the person literally named after the devil, calls them disgusting human beings, only using them as a last resort. We unknowingly see them in the first half of part 5. The person who killed Cerber and Zelato was Cicolata, with Secco filming the whole entire thing, and it was foreshadowing just how malicious they really were. One of the first glimpses we get of them is with their flashback, and that may have been the darkest thing I've ever watched in any show. Cicolata was a doctor who got fired after a simple mistake that killed a person. Some might have called him a failed elite, but his true nature wasn't found until he uncovered his stand. At a young age, Cicolata was an excellent student, and when he became a teenager, he decided to volunteer for an elderly home. Unknowing to anyone, he was using this opportunity to give unknown drugs to the elders, and repeatedly tell horrid things to them until it drove them to suicide. Cicolata kept extensive videos of the reactions the elders made when he told them those things, and after 9 people committed suicide, he finally decided that he wanted to become a doctor. When he was a doctor, he would do surgery on patients who didn't need it, and reduce the anesthesia so they would wake up in the middle of it. Being in this position of watching people die gave Cicolata a feeling of superiority, and he felt like he understood the psychology of human beings at that moment. The only person who he trusts is Secco. Not much is known about him, but it is said that he was one of Cicolata's former patients, and they ended up getting along, and now he only takes orders from him. His sadism can also be found in his stand, and how it's perhaps the most deadly one ever. Instead of the usual one-on-one fight that Stan usually partake in, Cicolata gets everyone involved, and his Green Day stand is a killer virus, where it's contractable from dead corpses, and you die by going below your base elevation. This aligns with the personality, and how he has a sense of superiority among everyone, and how he looks down on them. This is the fight with the most casualties, as Cicolata wiped out a good amount of the people in Rome with the virus. Secco, on the other hand, is an enigma. At the beginning, he seems like a brainwashed person who acts like an animal and only takes orders from Cicolata, but by the end, he turns into something much greater. Just like in the fight with Pesci and Prosciutto, we think Cicolata is the much greater threat in the beginning, but it actually ends up being Secco. When Cicolata dies, Secco loses all respect for him, as he only looked up to him because he was powerful, and loses the act he was holding before and becomes a much more intelligent human being. During the fight of Bruno, his true nature is revealed, and it's a very interesting shift of power. This fight was made to establish the most hateable villain in all of JoJo, so there could be a beatdown longer than Steely Dan, and this was accomplished with a fight concluding in a 7-page beatdown with them both dying in the hands of the garbage disposal. This fight showed us examples of people that went in the opposite direction of fate, and even though it had worked out for them thus far, it was eventually going to fail. As you can see from this example, flashbacks play a very important part of the show as they establish a backstory, set a theme for the upcoming scene, and show us a goal the character has. As you can see with Cicolata and Secco, each of these three things add to the story and character development, and give us a glimpse into their world. Probably the most important way these flashbacks were utilized were with the members of Team Bucciarati. From these flashbacks, we could decipher that each of the members had a pretty horrible childhood, and went through some kind of suffering, whether that be internal or external. They then all came together as a way to defy the fate they were given, and actually be someone deemed useful by society. It's actually kind of ironic because the modern crusaders, the people who were thrown out of society and deemed useless by it, are fighting for the betterment of society. These flashbacks make us feel for Team Bucciarati and shows their internal struggles. It makes us want them to win because we see the sacrifices they endured, how horrible the boss is, and their journey. Sometimes Araki even shows us the enemy in such a way in which we sympathize with them and are rooting for them to be the victor. We can also see this through the Hitman team and how they also have their own motives to overthrow the boss. Through the flashbacks, we see Cicolata kill the Hitman team members, Sorber and Gelato, with him butchering Sorber into many pieces and having Gelato watch while tied up as he choked on his own spit, which shows us how little respect the boss had for this team. This deeply affects the team, and they vow that they will get revenge on killing their members in such a horrifying way. Once they see Trish, they realize that this is the best opportunity to go after the boss because now they actually know what to look for. This makes us sympathize with the Hitman team, and that's why they're such a likable group. Instead of any other villain in this series, they actually are going up against the protagonist for reasons other than money. In turn, we get to see their story and their true nature, and we feel for the group, even sometimes wanting them to be the ones who win. The journey starts with Giorno and Bruno's first encounter, and this very encounter, as trivial as it might seem, sets the mood for the entire part. Giorno Giovanna is the son of Dio Brando and Jonathan Joestar, which is kind of weird. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with that. We can see traits from both these characters present in Giorno even before the fight starts. Giorno has a strong sense of justice and wants to make the world a better place, just like Jonathan, but he accomplishes his goals through any means necessary, even by killing, just like Dio Brando. These two personalities are also found in his stand, Gold Experience. It's a short-range stand that can deal devastating blows and optimal for killing, just like Saguardo. However, his stand ability is the ability to give life to any object, and thus can heal the wounds of others. This is a very caring and gentleman-like trait that is eminent in Jonathan Joestar, and because the stand is the manifestation of the user, we can see pretty evidently that Giorno has the good traits of each of these two characters. However, he doesn't use both these traits simultaneously, only using one at a time, showing that Giorno still needs time to grow as a person and accept these two parts of him. When Giorno can synchronize these two traits, that is when he can defeat the boss. During the first fight, we see the true nature of Giorno Giovanna and his strong sense of justice. As a child, Giorno had a tough upbringing as nobody really cared for him. People always bullied and harmed him to the point of depression. He always felt secluded, like he was the weird kid, the one doing everything wrong, and he felt as if everyone was right about him. This all, however, changed when he saved the gang member's life, and suddenly, everything in his life turned around. It turns out that because Giorno saved the gang member's life, he was now repaying him to the best of his abilities, and in a world where politicians were corrupt, and the police didn't protect the weak, ironically, the gang member was the one who straightened out Giorno's heart. Because of this, the thing he wanted the most in life was to be a gang star. When the fight versus Bruno occurs, we automatically see Giorno's strong sense of justice, and that he will eliminate anybody who opposes that, being Likai Luca, and help those who have the same feeling as him, being Bruno Bucciarati. We all see his shining resolve, and how he literally rips off his own arm so he can attack a split second faster, just so he can change fate and stand victorious, which sets up the theme that'll be relevant for the rest of the story. However, instead of going in for the kill like anybody else would, he notices some traits of Bucciarati's, like how he hesitates to fight him, and his reaction when he saw the drug-addicted kid's arm, and decides he's a good person. Not only does he spare him, but he tells him his own ambitions and how he wants to defeat the boss to rid the gang of any unjust people, and says how Bruno, deep down, also feels this way. As minor as this encounter may have been, we'll see in a later part of the story how this may have been one of the most important scenes in the whole part. Let's skip a little bit into the part and talk about Risotto, the ambassador of the Hitman team. He's the strongest member and has managed to be the only one that has stayed alive to this point, with the other members attempting to valiantly fight off Bucciarati and his team, but failing by only a little. The Hitman team is basically a direct complement to Team Bucciarati, as weird as that may seem. Each of these teams have a goal of overthrowing the boss because of something that he did, and each of them have given their resolve, grit, determination, and most importantly, sacrifice. Each of the team members that appears lies within Risotto while he's fighting the boss. To us, it seems like it's one-on-one, but in all reality, it's one-on-one in a different sense. It's one team versus one villain. Through his shining resolve, Risotto manages to put the boss in a position of death, but makes one huge blunder. He gets cocky. He says how the boss is already dead and how he's gonna murder him, which is ironically the opposite of the rule the Hitman team follows, where you finish the job before you say he's dead. However, maybe even more detrimental is the motive of the Hitman team. The motive of the Hitman team is different from Team Bucciarati's, as the form it possesses is revenge, which stems as a reaction, thus their motive is only reactionary. However, the motive of Team Bucciarati comes from the heart, and that is the reason they fail, because their motive only comes as a reaction, and not from the heart. Whereas the Hitman team's reasoning for killing the boss stems from revenge, Team Bucciarati's comes from the heart. Up until their first encounter with the boss, they've been giving the same thing the Hitman team has, their resolve, grit, determination, but the one thing they haven't given is any sacrifice, and that is one of the most necessary things in order to change fate. During Bruno's first encounter with the boss, what if I told you he was destined to lose from the very beginning? The mistake that Bruno made was that he let an external thing, that being the boss kidnapping Triss, determine his actions, which is a reactionary response which is very similar to the Hitman team's. This led to his death. Or did it? When Giorno comes to heal Bruno, he's already dead, but suddenly he springs up to life, showing his true resolve and willingness to change his fate, no matter what. After that, the team has to decide whether they want to follow Bruno or not, in basically a suicide mission against the boss. And not everyone innocently comes. Naranza, Gira, and Fugo stay behind, with Naranza eventually coming because he can relate to Triss. The two of them both have very similar backstories, as they were abandoned by the ones they trusted. He wanted to help Triss, so she wouldn't end up in the same situation he had gotten into. This scene shows us the resolve of Naranza, but more importantly, how weak he is. We see him in tears, and he gets caught up in his emotions, and even though he possesses a part of the qualities the gang possesses, if he wants to do the whole not dying thing, he needs to step up and grow more as a person. The next fight is a kind of initiation for Naransa into the gang. Even though he defeated Formaggio, he could basically just brute force that battle, but when going up against the best couple, Squalo and Tiasne, he was forced to use his thinking and ingenuity to come up on top. This fight was especially tough for Naransa, because he couldn't rely on others' help due to Talking Head, except for Jorno's, who has probably the most important ability anyone can possess, the ability to inspire others. Because of Jorno's actions, Jorno was put in danger to help Naransa, and unfortunately got incapacitated, and now it's up to Naransa to pay back Jorno with his newfound resolve and prove that he is a rightful member of the modern Crusaders. He then shows his resolve and quick thinking by cutting off his tongue and using Aerosmith to see who's braving spikes, because only stand users could see him cutting off his tongue. This in turn leads to a well-earned victory and establishes Naransa's place in the gang. The boat scene is also a crucial one because Panicotta Fugo decides to stay behind, and if it had to be anyone, then it had to be Fugo. Fugo symbolizes the sacrifices that the gang is going to have to make in order to beat the boss. Fugo is an extremely intelligent individual, with him having a high IQ and attending university at 13, but that doesn't mean that he hasn't had his troubles. As a child, he always had fits of rage, wanting to kill somebody, but he held this back until one day, his professor, who had been manipulating him sexually, started pestering him, and he couldn't hold back anymore and killed him. This stems from how his parents treated him and how they didn't treat him as a person, but more so as a prize because of how smart he was. Since his parents were rich, they made sure he wasn't convicted, but they basically disowned him and he was fated to live his life on the streets. This again shows us the true nature of his parents, and when they're in a situation where Fugo puts a bad name on their reputation, they disown him. Ironically, however, he used his knowledge more than he did at school so he could actually survive, until he met Bruno one day and became part of his gang. It made sense for Fugo to stay behind because of his character. He's the hot-headed member of the group and is ashamed of his personality. This can be seen for how he's ashamed of his stand and barely uses it unless he absolutely must. His stand is ravenous, almost out of control, and it's one of the strongest stands in the part, eliminating anybody nearby when he destroys the capsule and lets out the virus, even his allies and himself. His stand manifests the part of his soul Fugo hates the most and wants to get rid of. Fugo wouldn't have been strong enough to handle the journey because of how he can't even accept himself. Team Bucciarati has gone through all this trouble of defeating the Hitman team, the boss's assassins, and eventually the boss himself, all for the boss's daughter named Tris Una. Bro, what a bunch of simps, protecting a girl from assassins? Simp. Tris doesn't really have a backstory, but we can pretty confidently decipher her story using clues from the show. On the outside, Tris seems like she has life figured out and is on top of the world, but on the inside, that couldn't be further from the truth. Tris is the boss's daughter and is being hunted by other people so that they can use her to find a father she doesn't even know. When she finally meets her father, the family reunion goes a little south, as the boss may have tried to kill her and called her a mistake of the past. All this makes Tris angry at the world, and she becomes determined to overthrow the boss with Bruno and the gang, because these are the people in her life who she can trust and cares for. With the notorious chase fight, Tris finally becomes the person she was destined to become. This stand is immortal, and will follow the fastest thing in its vicinity. Jorno tried to defeat it by having it latch onto his arm and throwing his arm out of the plane, but that didn't work. This is detrimental since now they don't have Jorno's life-giving ability and can't heal the team because he doesn't have any hands to do so. However, hope was not lost because he's used his life-giving ability to turn one of his buttons into a hand, and now Notorious Chase is going after it. Tris is amazed at the gang and how they fight for what they think is right. Again, Jorno's resolve throughout the part helped Tris evolve as a person and gain the ability to fight for what she thinks is right. Then her stand. Spice Girl is summoned, and C suddenly seems different. C isn't the quiet, reserved side character that C was made out to be before this, but now is brimming with confidence and has gained the resolve to do what is right. With her new abilities, she uses her ingeniousness to defeat the Stand and makes a place for herself in Team Bucciarati and their quest to take down the boss. Leona Abacchio is that one emo guy who's probably into cock and ball torture, not that there's anything wrong with that, and you can tell just by his design that he's been through a lot. Abacchio was a lot like Giorno when he was young, having a strong sense of justice and wanting to change the world for the better through any means necessary, so he became a police officer. However, he then started to see the harsh realities of the world and just how depressing it really was. During Abacchio's time as a police officer, slowly his strong sense of justice that made him join the police force started fading away. The police were corrupt and took bribes from criminals just to make a little extra money. Not that it mattered anyways, because even if convicted, the suspect would just hire a crafty lawyer and get right back to the streets. Abacchio one time decided to surrender and be like any other police officer, and received a bribe from a criminal so he wouldn't go to jail. But it turns out that he would meet the criminal again, resulting in a shootout and one of his officers sacrificing his life for him. Now, Abacchio doesn't feel anything anymore. No emotions, nothing. And the only thing that gives him satisfaction is following orders from something absolute, like Bruno and the boss. Abacchio's moody jazz stand is a manifestation of the soul and signifies the part of his life he wants to forget. Throughout his life, the only thing he wants is to forget and come to accept what happened that day, but can't, and is constantly tormented with that scene, having it play over and over again in his head. This part of his soul gave him the stand ability, which has the ability to rewind time and play it again, but he can't interfere with the past that is being rewinded. Abacchio ends up using his moody jazz stand to rewind time and find the true identity of the boss. However, he ends up getting killed by the boss before he finds his true identity, and all is lost for the gang. Or is it? Using his last strength, he managed to smash the face of the boss into a stone and showed everyone the boss's true identity. The story of Leona Abacchio is handled perfectly, as we see him evolve into what he wants to be. It is worth noting that originally, he was quite opposed to Giorno, but ironically, Giorno ended up teaching him about resolve, and was the main thing that gave Abacchio the strength and resolve to smash the identity of the boss into the stone. Giorno embodied his former self, and his former self was the person who needed to again light the fire for the strong sense of justice he once had. His story culminates with him in heaven, meeting up with the officer who sacrificed his life for him, and it shows us that he regained the same sense of justice he once had, and how he would do anything for the truth. He has finally resolved his conflict and became the person who he always wanted to be. Guido Mista has always been the kind of outlier to the group, with his way of thinking being pretty different. Mista has always been the laid-back kind of guy who's always very honest and goes with the flow. He believes that each one of us has a predetermined fate, and no matter if we take the long or short path, we'll eventually get to it. Mista's fate occurs when he witnesses a crime and decides to fight back against it. When he wields the gun, he feels a new feeling, and he manages to kill the criminals while dodging all the bullets, even though they're being shot at almost point-blank range. Mista is different from everyone because he is true to himself and accepts his fate and does anything to achieve it. That is the reason why he lives and everyone else dies. He accepted his fate. However, just because he accepted his fate doesn't mean he didn't get the Giorno treatment. In his fight with Gyatso, when all hope seemed lost, Giorno showed him resolve and what it meant, and inspired Mista to show his own resolve and went through any means necessary. The fight with Cioccolata and Secco is one of the most important in the series, as the story really sets the mood for how big the stakes are for this fight, as mentioned in the last part. This is the time where you have to show what you've become and that you're worthy of being on this team, as it's the fight right before the boss. In this fight, Giorno seems to have grown as a person and stand user, with him being really confident in his ability and using it in crafty ways. He deceives Cioccolata by thinking he's giving him an opportunity to have him spared, but uses that deception against him and kills him. Bruno, on the other hand, shows off his resolve during his fight with Sekko, and what resolve truly means. Resolve is the ability to accomplish something through any means necessary, and Bruno really showed it off during this fight. He knew that Sekko's stand was stronger than his, so he used his body as a capsule to damage Sekko, eventually leading to his demise. Even after this fight, when he was on the brink of death, he showed his resolve by proceeding to go to the Colosseum, even though he was on the verge of death. Bruno showed us that this part was about resolve, and that we need resolve no matter what we do. Resolve is the most integral part in changing one's fate, and Bruno showed us this very thing. No matter what, Bruno was going to make it to the Colosseum, clinging on to the last stages of life, just so he could change his own fate, and change the fate of countless others, by putting an end to the boss. All throughout the part, we've been teased by who the true identity of the boss is. We know that the boss has only shown himself to his most trusted subordinate, but I don't think anybody could understand the true nature of his second in command, Vinegar Doppio. Doppio doesn't really seem like the type of guy that should be second to the boss, but yet he is. That's because Doppio is the boss. In the fight with Polnareff, we finally see the boss, which is the first time in the entirety of the show. Throughout the show, the boss has been talked up to be someone who never shows his identity, and that is further instilled with his encounter with Bruno. The fact that we see his stand and not his identity really shows us the true nature of the boss, and builds up suspense for the reveal of his identity. Additionally, when we see the face that Abacchio smashed onto the rock, it is very encrypted and confusing, further showing the boss as an enigma. However, when we see Doppio, we automatically think that he's the boss's second in command, because he doesn't seem like the type of person the boss would be. He has a very cowardly and reserved stature and personality, but in the scene of Polnareff, we see that Doppio is in fact Diavolo. More precisely, we see Doppio taking off his shirt from behind a pillar, and when he emerges out the other side, he is an entirely different person. That's because Diavolo suffers from multiple personality disorder. This can be seen from multiple different places, like the aforementioned appearance of Diavolo. He appeared from behind a pillar, seeming though as an entirely different person, but it was still the same person. Doppio is Diavolo's younger, more innocent self, while Diavolo is the ruthless leader of Passion whom we come to know. Aside from this, we can see this from how they share the same stand and their conversations through the phone. Each of these indicate that they're both the same person, but never outright say it, having to make us look a little deeper and determine it for ourselves. But what led Doppio to become Diavolo? It was definitely some traumatic event or a realization, but we never get a concrete answer from the show. We only know a bit of their backstory and how Doppio was an enigma ever since he was born, and his Diavolo side started to appear around when he was a teen when he set fire to his village. Other than this, not much is known about either of them, but that's a good thing. It was intentional to have this character be ambiguous and a mystery compared to all the other JoJo villains, and that's completely intended. The boss isn't supposed to be just some villain, but instead is supposed to be some entity which symbolizes all the evil and injustice in the world. Jean-Pierre Polnareff, on the other hand, other than being a sexy Frenchman, symbolizes hope and the desire to do good in the world. After Bruno's encounter with the boss, the gang didn't really have a plan to defeat Diavolo. They just thought that they could look for the identity of the boss and use their resolve to find a way to defeat him, but that's not how it works. You can only have resolve take you so far in the world before you need a plan, and Polnareff represents this. He contacts them at their most desperate time of need, and offers them a chance to defeat Diavolo at the Colosseum. They reluctantly agree, and they have a plan. Now they have to use their resolve to come to the Colosseum and retrieve the golden arrow. This is when resolve shines the brightest, when you have a clear goal with a clear plan, and will do anything to achieve it. Polnareff's design has changed drastically since Stardust Crusaders. He seems more mature versus his joking demeanor in part 3, and looks like he's experienced the hardest of the world. He also is a lot smarter, as seen during his second encounter with King Crimson. He has a plan on how he could see when time is skipped, by biting his hand and counting the droplets of blood. He would then count the droplets, and if the number counted didn't align, then time had skipped. In this part, Polnareff is the giver of hope, while the arrow is hope. The arrow is the only thing that can kill Diavolo, and Polnareff is the only way the modern Crusaders can get it. Polnareff shows his resolve against fate and doesn't let Diavolo beat him by summoning his stand and having the arrow pierce Silver Chariot, transforming him into Chariot Requiem. Notice how it's not Silver Chariot Requiem and doesn't retain its full name like the other Requiem stand in this part. This is because Polnareff isn't ready to fully wield the true power of the arrow, and thus his stand suffers from it. However, even though Chariot Requiem isn't fully developed, it's still one of the most powerful stands in all of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Chariot Requiem is a Berserk stand, and its only goal is the one thing that Polnareff wanted the most in the world to accomplish, and that is to keep the arrow safe. That is the only thing that this stand needs to do, and it will do it by any means necessary, which includes swapping everyone's bodies, and then have them transform into something completely different, until they are physically incapable of getting the arrow, so that it could be deemed safe. This stand represents the one thing we have to overcome if we want to change fate, and that is ourselves. Chariot Requiem is the shadow of one's soul, and attacking him means attacking yourself. This is present with how, when attacking the stand, then quite literally, your stand will attack you to stop you from attacking Silver Chariot Requiem. You quite literally have to attack yourself, and the victor, the one with the most resolve, will be the one who will get the arrow, and quite literally, rule over fate and other souls. However, there are many things that are needed to change fate: grit, resolve, determination, and sacrifice, which is what this arc focuses on. Right in the beginning, when everybody's bodies are sweats, the team automatically tries to jump to conclusions and assumes that Bruno's body is where Diavolo is hiding. They try to skip the steps right to the conclusion and are punished for it with Narance's death. This is especially cruel, as Narance's body and voice announces his death, which just shows the cruelness of fate. This shows that if you try to skip the steps necessary with changing fate, then you won't be successful and will lose sight of the truth, which is similar to what Diavolo is doing. When we were first introduced to Bruno Bucciarati, we thought that he was just another run-of-the-mill antagonist, but before long, we respected him more than our own parents. Bruno Bucciarati is basically the antithesis of what a person should strive to be. He cares deeply about his own team, does anything to achieve his goal, has a shining resolve and a strong sense of justice, just like Giorno. He is the symbol of justice. Bruno's first encounter with gangs was when his father was shot because he witnessed the drug dealing, and ever since then he had a hatred for them. He hated how they would get outside people involved in their dealings, and how they were selling drugs and ruining the lives of many people, including women and children. In his strange twist of fate, he was forced to join Passione to gain protection from the gangsters for his father, and he never had the strength to do what he thought was right, and rid all the injustice going on in Passione. However, then Giorno came and set Bruno's mind straight during their fight, which is one of the most important scenes in the whole show. Before this, he was asleep and a slave to his fate, but then Giorno sat and resolved in their first encounter, inspired Bucciarati, and he finally had the courage to have the resolve to change his own fate to make the world a better place. He awoke, having his soul reborn, and had the courage to take the first steps of what he knew was right. This in turn gave him the resolve to not die with the King Crimson fight, as his resolve was so strong that his soul returned to his body for a little while. He was also the one to defeat Silver Chariot Requiem by sacrificing his soul, instead of Diavolo, who only crippled him by damaging only a part of his soul, again skipping to the results and leading to a failure of seizing the arrow. Bruno's resolve was the last bit that the gang needed in order to defeat the boss, and even after his death, his resolve shone the brightest. His figure, engulfed in gold and surrounded by angels, is taken up to heaven, and he leaves the rest to Giorno Giovanna. Zorno and Diavolo have a certain duality between them. They are both direct contrasts of each other. Zorno embodies what is good in the world. Diavolo embodies what is bad. Zorno and Diavolo differ in their view on their past. While Zorno looks at his past mistakes as something that is necessary and that he should learn from to better himself, Diavolo tries to eliminate the past and thinks of it as a mistake. This in turn leads to him making the same mistakes over and over again because he doesn't learn from them. Because all he wants to do is erase the past and everything with it. He doesn't use it like Zorno does, and therefore falls for the same mistakes over and over again. We can also see this through their approach on fate. Zorno believes that fate can be changed through resolve, grit, hardship, sacrifice. It is necessary to not take any shortcuts, because then you'll lose sight of the truth of the thing you want to accomplish, but more importantly, you won't be staying true to yourself. He has a clear goal, which is to stop the corruption going on in Italy by taking control of Passione and eradicating all the evil there. He wants to inspire and change the world for the better, just like the gangster that changed his life for him. He is the embodiment of resolve, willing to change the fate of Italy no matter what, and through his resolve, he inspires others to strengthen their own resolve. Diavolo doesn't change fate through resolve. He changes it by taking shortcuts and simply avoiding it through his King Crimson stand. Even though the visions that appear in King Crimson's eulogy are absolute, he doesn't change fate, but just puts himself in a more favorable position while stopping time. He only puts himself in a position to win through King Crimson, and then executing it, while in turn skipping all the necessary steps that need to be there while changing your fate. If you only desire the goal without putting the steps in, then you will never reach the truth. You'll lose sight of the goal when you only concern yourself with the results, instead of the actions which lead you to the goal. Diavolo, throughout the entirety of the story, has been a reactive villain, instead of the proactive ones which we usually see. Usually the villain is trying to go up against society to change it, but in this story, Diavolo is society, and Zorno is trying to change society. Not much is known about Diavolo. His backstory is purposely confusing, but that's okay, because he's not the villain, but more so the epiphysis of fate. He is fate himself, with his King Crimson stand. He is the status quo. If Zorno can overcome this, then he will be fate itself. Diavolo's take on fate is just a superficial take on the main theme, and is therefore fated to fail. Then it happens. Finally, the moment we've all been waiting for, the thing that this part has been leading up to, the climax of the story. Zorno gets the arrow and turns into one of the most overpowered stand users of all time. His stand transforms, like a caterpillar coming out of his cocoon and transforming into a beautiful butterfly. Now, Zorno's journey has come to an end. He is mature enough to manifest Gold Experience Requiem. Notice how it's not just Experience Requiem and actually possesses its full name, unlike Polnareff's. This shows us that Zorno is ready for the transformation, which is a testament of just how powerful he has become. This moment signifies the end of his journey, and now he has finally accepted both his Jonathan and Dio side, and learned to use both in harmony with each other, making him a literal god amongst men, the thing Dio Brando strived to be. Zorno has become the antithesis of Diavolo. He has become fate itself, the very thing that Diavolo tried to become. Through Zorno's resolve to change his fate, he has accepted his fate, and thus become fate itself. One of the most important scenes of this part was with Abacchio's deceased police partner, saying that when changing one's fate, you should never take any shortcuts, because then you'll lose sight of the truth. This is the exact pitfall that Diavolo has fallen into with his King Crimson ability. Diavolo's King Crimson ability allowed him to skip all the necessary steps which are needed to change fate by skipping time. He thus lost sight of the truth because he was only focused on the results and not the journey. This is why he was destined to fail from the very beginning. This is why he didn't get the arrow and Zorno did. Ironically, the one thing about his past that was still haunting him, Tris, was the one who denied him the arrow. Diavolo's past eventually caught up to him, no matter how hard he tried to destroy it. Zorno put in what was necessary to change fate, and thus, he was fated to win all along. King Crimson's eulogy shows what is fated to happen, and it's absolute. It can never change. Just like how it was fated to get hit with the knife in Risotto's fight, even though he knew about that, he couldn't change it. The way that Diavolo gets around this is by skipping time and having the fated thing happen, but instead putting himself in a more favorable position. This is a kind of perverted version of the main theme, as while the main theme is the resolve to change fate, Diavolo changes fate without any resolve. When Diavolo's King Crimson eulogy destined him to win against Giorno, the eulogy wasn't wrong, but not right either. Gold Experience Requiem overcame this and changed the fate of Diavolo by having him go into another dimension where he is fated to die over and over again. While Diavolo only ever concerned himself with the results, Gold Experience Requiem is able to erase any and all results forever. Giorno becomes fate itself and delivers Diavolo his punishment for not going through the necessary steps in changing fate. His punishment is that he'll never be able to reach the truth because he's lost sight of it by only skipping to the results. He is condemned to a fate where, because of his universe, he will never have any effect on the world. No matter how hard he tries, he will never be able to change or influence the world to his liking. He will forever be denied by the universe the ability to change his or anyone else's fate. Golden Wind's final arc, Sleeping Slaves, at face value is probably one of the weirdest final arcs you can have, but when you look into it, then you realize that it captures the whole entire theme of the series. Sleeping Slaves focuses on a journey of Team Bucciarati's before they met Giorno, where they go to investigate a possible murder. They there find out the suspect is a stand user, but not one like everyone else, since he doesn't control his stand, but rather fate does. The stand will focus on the person who is set to die soon, and if he touches it, then he will have a peaceful death. This stone is mercy. It gives you an escape from the hardships you'll have to face. The stone then morphs into Bruno. Mista tries to destroy the stone and accomplishes his goal and in turn saves Bruno. However, the stone isn't destroyed, and now instead of only morphing into Bruno, it also morphs into Naranza and Abacchio, which is a testament to just how hard their up-and-coming journey will be. They were all fated to die from the very beginning in the pursuit of what they thought was right, and nothing would have changed that. This arc shows how the gang were sleeping slaves, and were finally awakened with the introduction of Giorno Giovanna. They allowed fate to control them, and did nothing about it. Mista kind of accomplished his goal of destroying the stone because he insinuated the journey. He had the resolve to change fate, and not let fate control them, and with the introduction of Giorno, they finally awakened and started the journey that they always wanted to, and which they believed was the right thing to do. Throughout their journey, they grow as people, having their resolve be strengthened, and finally waking up, not letting fate control them anymore. Bruno wakes up with his first encounter with Giorno, where he is inspired by his just goal and resolve to do it. Mista is inspired in his fight with Gyatso, where Giorno gives him the speech about resolve and what it truly means. Naranza wakes up when the gang sets out on the new adventure to kill the boss, and Naranza sees the resolve of everyone, and how Triss is exactly like him. Abacchio wakes up through Giorno's resolve, and finally sees something through to the end, and doesn't lose sight of the truth when he smashes the boss's face into the rock. Triss wakes up when she sees the gang's resolve, and how they will do anything to accomplish their goal. Fugo never wakes up. He is still a sleeping slave. Even though he's inspired by Giorno, he still lets fate control him, and that's because he's the weakest one of the group and hasn't come to terms with himself. Giorno inspired Team Bucciarati with his goal of ridding the evil and injustice in Italy by defeating the boss and taking control of La Passion. Diavolo, on the other hand, never opens his eyes. He is still a sleeping slave. Diavolo thought that he was some great warrior of fate with his King Crimson stand, but he was blind to the truth. Because he was so obsessed with the idea of fate, he let it fully take control of his life. He thought that he was in control of fate, but in reality, fate was in control of him. Diavolo was fated to fail from the very beginning, and Team Bucciarati was fated to win from the very beginning because of their resolve to fight their fate. Golden Wind is a very complex show, with many underlying themes and messages. There is so much more that I could still go into with this show, such as the foreshadowing, some more of the characters, basically the whole first part, hell, even the intros. But I actually want to get this video out, so I'm not. However, if this show had to be summarized in only a couple of words, it would be the resolve to change fate. The resolve to change fate is what this part is about, from the very beginning to the very end. Giorno and Team Bucciarati resolved against fate to defeat the boss and accomplish their goals. Diavolo, as the antagonist, was the complete opposite of this, with him not changing fate through resolve, but instead just changing fate through King Crimson. This is why he was fated to lose from the very beginning. Everything that happened in this show happens because the characters had the resolve to change fate. However, this theme can also be applied in our own lives. We should possess the resolve to change fate in something that we want to do. We shouldn't be sleeping slaves, letting fate control us, and instead, wake up with a purpose of fulfilling our journey in life by changing our fate. This is why Golden Wind is perfection. This show inspires us to become better versions of ourselves by giving us the ability to have the resolve to change fate and waking us up. It gives us a message that we can do anything that we want, as long as we put in the necessary steps that are needed to change fate. This is why Golden Wind is perfect.